Chapter 23 of Ester Ried. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ester Ried by Pansy. Chapter 23 Crosses. The large church was very full. There seemed not to be another space for a human being. People who were not much given to frequenting the house of God on a week-day evening had certainly been drawn thither at this time. Sadie Ried sat beside Ester in her mother's pew, and Harry Arnett, with a sober look on his boyish face, sat bolt upright in the end of the pew, while even Dr. Douglass leaned forward with graceful nonchalance from the seat behind them, and now and then addressed a word to Sadie. These people had been listening to such a sermon as is very seldom heard. That blessed man of God whose name is dear to hundreds and thousands of people, whose hair is whitened with the frost of many a year spent in the Master's service, whose voice and brain and heart are yet strong, and powerful, and "mighty through God," the Reverend Mr. Parker, had been speaking to them, and his theme had been the soul, and his text had been, "What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world, and lose his own soul?" I hope I am writing for many who have had the honor of hearing that appeal fresh from the great brain and greater heart of Mr. Parker. Such will understand the spell under which his congregation sat even after the prayer and hymn had died into silence. Now the gray-haired veteran stood bending over the pulpit, waiting for the Christian witnesses to the truth of his solemn messages, and for that he seemed likely to wait. A few earnest men, veterans too in the cause, gave in their testimony, and then occurred one of those miserable, disheartening, disgraceful pauses which are met with nowhere on earth among a company of intelligent men and women, with liberty given them to talk, save in a prayer meeting. Still silence, and still the aged servant stood with one arm resting on the Bible, and looked down almost beseechingly upon that crowd of dumb Christians. "Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord," he repeated, in earnest, pleading tones. Miserable witnesses they! Was not the Lord ashamed of them all, I wonder? Something like this flitted through Ester's brain as she looked around upon that faithless company, and noted here and there one who certainly ought to "take up his cross." Then some slight idea of the folly of that expression struck her. What a fearful cross it was, to be sure! What a strange idea to use the same word in describing it that was used for that blood-stained, nail-pierced cross on Calvary! Then a thought, very startling in its significance, came to her. Was that cross borne only for men? Were they the only ones who had a thank-offering because of Calvary? Surely her Savior hung there and bled, and groaned, and died for her! Why should not she say, "By his stripes I am healed"? What if she should? What would people think? No, not that either. What would Jesus think? That, after all, was the important question. Did she really believe that if she should say in the hearing of that assembled company, "I love Jesus," that Jesus, looking down upon her, and hearing how her timid voice broke the dishonoring silence, would be displeased, would set it down among the long list of "ought not to have dones"? She tried to imagine herself speaking to him in her closet after this manner: "Dear Savior, I confess with shame that I have brought reproach upon thy name this day, for I said, in the presence of a great company of witnesses, that I loved thee." In defiance of her former education and former belief upon this subject, Ester was obliged to confess, then and there, that all this was extremely ridiculous. "Oh, well," said Satan, "it's not exactly wrong, of course, but then it isn't very modest or ladylike, and besides, it is unnecessary. There are plenty of men to do the talking." "But," said common sense, "I don't see why it's a bit more unladylike than the ladies' colloquy at the Lyceum was last evening. There were more people present than are here to night, and as for the men, they are perfectly mum. There seems to be plenty of opportunity for somebody." "Well," said Satan, "it isn't customary, at least, and people will think strangely of you. Doubtless it would do more harm than good." This most potent argument, that people will think strangely of you, smothered common sense at once, as it is apt to do, and Ester raised her head from the bowed position which it had occupied during this whirl of thought, and considered the question settled. Someone began to sing, and of all the words that could have been chosen, came the most unfortunate ones for this decision. On my head he poured his blessing long time ago, Now he calls me to confess him before I go. My past life, all vile and hateful, he saved from sin; I should be the most ungrateful not to own him. Death and hell he bade defiance, bore cross and pain; Shame my tongue this guilty silence, and speak his name. This at once renewed the struggle, but in a different form. She no longer said ought I, but can I? Still the spell of silence seemed unbroken save by here and there a voice, and still Ester parleyed with her conscience, getting as far now as to say, when Mr. Jones sits down, if there is another silence, I will try to say something; not quite meaning, though, to do any such thing, and proving her word false by sitting very still after Mr. Jones sat down, though there was plenty of silence. Then, when Mr. Smith said a few words, Ester whispered the same assurance to herself, with exactly the same result. The something decided, for which she had been longing, the opportunity to show the world just where she stood, had come at last, and this was the way in which she was meeting it. At last she knew by the heavy thuds which her heart began to give, that the question was decided, that the very moment Deacon Graves sat down she would rise; whether she would say anything or not would depend upon whether God gave her anything to say, but at least she could stand up for Jesus. But Mr. Parker's voice followed Deacon Graves', and this was what he said: "Am I to understand by your silence that there is not a Christian man or woman in all this company who has an unconverted friend whom he or she would like to have us pray for?" Then the watching angel of the covenant came to the help of this trembling, struggling Ester, and there entered into her heart such a sudden and overwhelming sense of longing for Sadie's conversion, that all thought of what she would say, and how she would say it, and what people would think, passed utterly out of her mind, and rising suddenly, she spoke, in clear and wonderfully earnest tones: "Will you pray for a dear, dear friend?" God sometimes uses very humble means with which to break the spell of silence which Satan so often weaves around Christians. It was as if they had all suddenly awakened to a sense of their privileges. Dr. Van Anden said, in a voice which quivered with feeling: "I have a brother in the profession for whom I ask your prayers that he may become acquainted with the great Physician." Request followed request for husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, and children. Even timid, meek faced, low voiced Mrs. Ried murmured a request for her children who were out of Christ. And when at last Harry Arnett suddenly lifted his handsome boyish head from its bowed position, and said in tones which conveyed the sense of a decision, "Pray for me," the last film of worldliness vanished, and there are those living to day who have reason never to forget that meeting. Is it your private opinion that our good doctor got up a streak of disinterested enthusiasm over my unworthy self this evening? This question Dr. Douglass asked of Sadie as they lingered on the piazza in the moonlight. Sadie laughed gleefully. "I am sure I don't know. I'm prepared for anything strange that can possibly happen. Mother and Ester between them have turned the world upside down for me to night. In case you are the happy man, I hope you are grateful?" "Extremely. Should be more so, perhaps, if people would be just to me in private, and not so alarmingly generous in public." "How bitter you are against Dr. Van Anden," Sadie said, watching the lowering brow and sarcastic curve of the lip with curious eyes. "How much I should like to know precisely what is the trouble between you." Dr. Douglass instantly recovered his suavity. "Do I appear bitter? I beg your pardon for exhibiting so ungentlemanly a phase of human nature; yet hypocrisy does move me to—" And then occurred one of those sudden periods with which Dr. Douglass always seemed to stop himself when anything not quite courteous was being said. "Just forget that last sentence," he added. "It was unwise and unkind. The trouble between us is not worthy of a thought of yours. I wish I could forget it. I believe I could, if he would allow me." At this particular moment the subject of the above conversation appeared at the door. Sadie gave a slight start; the thought that Dr. Van Anden had heard the talk was not pleasant. She need not have feared; he had just come from his room, and from his knees. He spoke abruptly, and with a touch of nervousness: "Dr. Douglass, may I have a few words with you in private?" Dr. Douglass's "certainly, if Sadie will excuse us," was both prompt and courteous apparently, though though the tone said, almost as plainly as words could have done, "To what can I be indebted for this honor?" Dr. Van Anden led the way into the brightly lighted vacant parlor, and there Dr. Douglass stationed himself directly under the gas light, where he could command a full view of the pale, somewhat anxious face of his companion, and waited with that indescribable air made up of nonchalance and insolence. Dr. Van Anden dashed into his subject. "Dr. Douglass, 10 years ago you did what you could to injure me. I thought then purposely, I think now that perhaps you were sincere. Be that as it may, I used language to you then, which I, as a Christian man, ought never to have used. I have repented it long ago, but in my blindness I have never seen that I ought to apologize to you for it until this evening. God has shown me my duty. Dr. Douglass, I ask your pardon for the angry words I spoke to you that day." The gentleman addressed kept his full, bright eyes fixed on Dr. Van Anden, and answered him in the quietest and at the same time iciest of tones: "You are certainly very kind, now that your anger has had time to cool during these 10 years, to accord to me the merit of being possibly sincere. Now I was more Christian in my conclusions. I set you down as an honest blunderer. That I have had occasion since to change my opinion is nothing to the purpose, but it would be pleasanter to both of us if apologies could restore our friend, Mrs. Lyons, to life." During this response Dr. Van Anden's face was a study. It had passed in quick succession through so many shades of feeling, anxiety, anger, disgust, and finally surprise, and apparently a dawning sense of a new development, for he made the apparently irrelevant reply: "Do you think I administered that chloroform?" Dr. Douglass' coolness forsook him for a moment. "Who did?" he queried, with flashing eyes. "Dr. Gilbert." "Dr. Gilbert?" "Yes, sir." "How does it happen that I never knew it?" "I am sure I do not know." Dr. Van Anden passed his hand across his eyes, and spoke in sadness and weariness. "I had no conception that you were not aware of it until this moment. It explains in part what was strangely mysterious to me, but even in that case it would have been, as you said, a blunder, not a criminal act. However, we can not undo that past. I desire, above all other things, to set myself right in your eyes as a Christian man. I think I may have been a stumbling block to you. God only knows how bitter is the thought I have done wrong. I should have acknowledged it years ago. I can only do it now. Again I ask you, Dr. Douglass, will you pardon those bitterly spoken words of mine?" Dr. Douglass bowed stiffly, with an increase of hauteur visible in every line of his face. "Give yourself no uneasiness on that score, Dr. Van Anden, nor on any other, I beg you, so far as I am concerned. My opinion of Christianity is peculiar, perhaps, but has not altered of late, nor is it likely to do so. Of course, every gentleman is bound to accept the apology of another, however tardily it may be offered. Shall I bid you good evening, sir?" And with a very low, very dignified bow, Dr. Douglass went back to the piazza and Sadie; and groaning in spirit over the tardiness of his effort, Dr. Van Anden returned to his room, and prayed that he might renew his zeal and his longing for the conversion of that man's soul. "Have you been receiving a little fraternal advice?" queried Sadie, her mischievous eyes dancing with fun over the supposed discomfiture of one of the two gentlemen, she cared very little which. "Not at all. On the contrary, I have been giving a little of that mixture in a rather unpalatable form, I fear. I haven't a very high opinion of the world, Miss Sadie." "Including yourself, do you mean?" was Sadie's demure reply. Dr. Douglass looked the least bit annoyed, then he laughed, and answered with quiet grace: "Yes, including even such an important individual as myself. However, I have one merit which I consider very rare sincerity." Sadie's face assumed a half puzzled, half amused expression, as she tried by the moonlight to give a searching look at the handsome form leaning against the pillar opposite her. "I wonder if you are as sincere as you pretend to be," was her next complimentary sentence. "And also I wonder if the rest of the world were as unlimited a set of humbugs as you suppose? How do you fancy you happened to escape getting mixed up with that general humbugism of the world? This Mr. Parker, now, talks as though he felt it and meant it." "He is a first class fanatic of the most outrageous sort. There ought to be a law forbidding such ranters to hold forth, on pain of imprisonment for life." "Dr. Douglass," said Sadie, speaking with grave dignity, "I would rather not hear you speak of that old gentleman in such a manner. He may be a fanatic and a ranter, but I believe he means it, and I can't help respecting him more than any cold blooded moralist that I ever met. Besides, I cannot forget that my honored father was among the despised class of whom you speak so scornfully." "My dear friend," and Mr. Douglass' tone was as gentle as her mother's could have been, "forgive me if I have pained you. It was not intentional. I do not know what I have been saying some unkind things perhaps, and that is always ungentlemanly. But I have been greatly disturbed this evening, and that must be my apology. Pardon me for detaining you for so long in the evening air. May I advise you, professionally, to go in immediately?" "May I advise you unselfishly to get into a better humor with the world in general, and Dr. Van Anden in particular, before you undertake to talk with a lady again?" Sadie answered in her usual tones of raillery; all her dignity had departed. "Meantime, if you would like to have unmolested possession of this piazza to assist you in tramping off your evil spirit, you shall be indulged. I'm going to the west side. The evening air and I are excellent friends." And with a mocking laugh and bow Sadie departed. "I wonder," she soliloquized, returning to gravity the moment she was alone, "I wonder what that man has been saying to him now? How unhappy these two gentlemen make themselves. It would be a consolation to know right from wrong. I just wish I believed in everybody as I used to. The idea of this gray headed minister being a hypocrite! That's absurd. But then the idea of Dr. Van Anden being what he is! Well, it's a queer world. I believe I'll go to bed." CHAPTER 24. Isabella